Okay, I hope I'm doing this properly. Can you see my PowerPoint, folks?
No.
Not yet. Okay, it looks like it's just loading, so.
We see it now.
Okay, and can you see me as well, or?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, so long as we have both of those, then I can get started. Okay, and please just, interrupt me because I'm not going to be able to pay attention to the chat. So if, if you can help me with that, I would greatly appreciate that. Can you still see my screen and my PowerPoint, or now are you seeing my talking points?
I see. It looks like a cover. It looks like your top slide. It says decolonial mirrors and shifting the
Good.
gaze. Yeah. Okay. And I'll
Okay.
keep an eye on the chat as well. And people should feel free, as she said, to ask questions.
Okay. Okay, great. First, I just want to thank Fiona and Star for joining me in this strand on decolonization. It's really an honor to be presenting with you. I'm sorry I didn't get in all of Star's presentation, and I hope to check it out later. But I really just want to acknowledge the amount of work that goes into operationalizing, some of these endeavors. Especially after something has been dormant for so long, which, the implementation of the legislation has been dormant in terms of just, there's not, as Fiona indicated, there hasn't been much implementation, and certainly not a strategic plan or funding associated with implementation of the actual piece of legislation. So I want to just, encourage you and start off by locating myself. I'm from Indian Island, Maine, and I am of the Penobscot Indian Nation. I'm a professor here out at the University of Alberta in Canada, and I have spent much of my career dedicated to working with, in our Faculty of Education, working with pre-service teachers in our Faculty of Education. In fact, the province that I work in Alberta was the first, and the university was the first in the province of Alberta to have a compulsory course on Indigenous education for pre-service teachers. So unlike Maine, we don't have necessarily a piece of legislation that requires the teaching of Wabanaki peoples, but we have embedded within our pre-service teacher baccalaureate program, which we educate over 70% of the province's teachers in our Faculty of Education, is a compulsory course that I also lobby forward within our governance structure here, and help to author and lead the delivery of that course. We reach over 1,400 pre-service teachers every year in that one course. It's a compulsory course, and it's the first of its kind in the province. So, okay, so, what I am about to engage with, in the next little bit is some difficult knowledge. I'm going to address, some big concepts, and then, invite you to just really think on them. There won't be a lot of time to do question and answer. And, you'll see in my last slide that I'm offering you, various publications and, opportunities for self-development in this area. And that's why I've entitled the talk Decolonial Mirrors, because it's really an opportunity to hold up and maybe look at ourselves and our own teaching practice and pedagogy and approach to this work, instead of necessarily a look at Native people. Okay. And so I will give, I will offer some of that because I think that some history needs to contextualize what I have to say, but I'm going to be covering some big concepts. One of the big concepts is genocide. And another big concept is anti-racism, anti-racist education, and a term that I have introduced into the literature that I've identified as anti-racist conviction. And so I would encourage you, as you approach the material and, engage in the discussion with me today, to do what leading anti-racist scholar, Aboriginal scholar, Dr. Verna St. Dennis encourages us to do when we are approaching anti-racism, which is to really thicken our skins and open our hearts. And I invite you to do that as I go over some of the difficult knowledge, in my talk. And this is what I also say at the beginning of most of my, anti-racist lectures with the pre-service teachers that we work with out here at the University of Alberta. And so I want to just start, let me see, I'm going to start with something that I want to underpin the discussion today. And it is very recent and relevant to the world and world news. It's made international news, but it's actually a very old understanding and reality that many of us as Native people have understood and have lived with. And that is the news of the mass burial of the 215 Tecumseh Indigenous peoples in Kamloops, British Columbia. And, I want to speak to that. The Honorable Representative Donna Loring spoke about the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because so many Indigenous peoples and Penobscots, where I come from, my ancestors were taken away and went to that school. And I'm going to speak specifically about that. And how there is a mass burial was found at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School as well. And our peoples, there's over 1,000 unnamed people that were also there. And there are unnamed graves there as well. So it's not something that just happens out west here in Canada, I guess, is what I want to make sure. That is another big idea, that I help folks think through here, okay? And my intention in offering you big ideas as teachers and educators is so that you can delve more into this. And I acknowledge that many of you have not had an opportunity have not been afforded the opportunity to have any of this in your undergraduate experience. I want to reinforce, what Fiona has said, that in the University of Maine system, there isn't an opportunity, certainly a compulsory opportunity. We have a fabulous Native Studies program at the University of Maine, but there is nothing that is compulsory for pre-service teachers to take that is a focus on Indigenous education and the history of Indigenous peoples in the context of education in contemporary lives, okay? So I share a lot of these big ideas, knowing that there isn't a lot of background teaching or learning opportunities to engage with these big ideas. And I think that we really need to start with the big ideas. And it's like Justice Murray Sinclair says about reconciliation. And we have a Maine TRC as well, which is important for all teachers to familiarize yourselves with. And I actually didn't put that in my ending Google. So if someone wants to help me find the link to that TRC, it's an excellent document to sort of also pin down the big ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you today. Okay. And the intention is to share the big ideas because they haven't been afforded in an undergraduate experience in your teacher preparation. And they are foundational to approaching this material, because if we don't really have an understanding of, the concept of genocide, then we will be intrepid about teaching about it. Okay, so, and at this point, it's really the onus and the political will of teachers to self-educate on these matters, because you certainly aren't getting it in Maine anyhow, in your undergraduate experience in a compulsory way. Okay, so I want to start with Justice Murray Sinclair and his response to the mass burial of the 215 Tecumseh children and babies that were found of the mass burial. He recently gave this talk at the University of British Columbia, and he was asked for his thoughts, about this. And, he goes on to say that it was information that was not unknown. It was information that lacked specificity. So it was, people knew in these communities that there was some sort of mass burial, okay? He also critiqued and lambasted the public education system in Canada. And I would say that the United States certainly falls within this, which for many generations taught a white supremacist history, one in which everything white people did was good, while those who fought Europeans expanding their territorial reach was negative. Okay. So he goes on to say that a white supremacist history in public school education, quote, taught so long, so hard, and so well that it has resulted in a belief on part of non-Indigenous students believing in the superiority of their own existence, superiority of their people, superiority of their ancestors versus the inferiority of Indigenous peoples in this country. And I would assert that the same thing in the United States. This isn't just a phenomena that's happened out here in Canada. Okay. And this is where, I want to start, let me see, with the PowerPoint. And I'm going to attempt to move my PowerPoint slides while I'm talking with you here. Oh, it moved. Okay, great. Okay, great. Okay, so I want to talk to you about the scalping proclamation. About 20 years ago, when the law was enacted, I spoke to a social studies conference, and there had to have been, gosh, at least 100 teachers in the room, and we gathered in Augusta, and the LD 291 had just been passed. We were embarking upon implementation. I asked the group how many of the teachers were familiar with this bounty, and there was just a handful of individuals that raised their hand. And if we were in a room, I would ask you the same thing. And so they then posed the question: how many individuals were familiar with Anne Frank's diary and the Nazi Holocaust? And rightfully so. Many, raised their hand, probably the overwhelming majority of the room. I then continued to ask how many taught about either the Nazi Holocaust or used Anne Frank's diary as a curricular resource in their classroom when teaching social studies. And again, the majority of teachers raised their hand. And I then found out that teachers were teaching this as early as using Anne Frank's diary as early as 4th grade. And so rightfully so, Anne Frank's diary needs to continue to be taught. And in equal ways, teachers need to be familiar with this genocidal bounty and engage in approaches and how to teach about it. Okay, because it does mark the first wave of policy against Indigenous peoples in North America. And it accounts for over 97% depletion of original populations in North America of Indigenous peoples. And so in Maine alone, there were over 20 Wabanaki tribes before Europeans got here. Today, there exist 5, okay? And in bounties like this, and it's a call on Penobscot scalps and live bodies. I want to just say, a little bit about that. And I'm going to extrapolate here directly from my dissertation of 2011. And I went back to this because of the mass burial, found in Tecumseh, because I'm doing some analysis, and this is what I've recently, it's heavy on my mind and my heart. And I want to share with you how this happened and what happened in the state of Maine and in Pennsylvania, and specific to Indian Island, where I come from, the Penobscot Nation. So the scalp bounty was enacted in 1755, shortly after the American Revolution. Lands seized by the British were either allocated to soldiers or in the case of coastal property, sold to the highest bidders. The following colonial account of one of the most coveted fishing areas were the rivers. And this is actually, this is something that it's sort of like a side thought, okay? And especially I want to bring your attention to the town of Westbrook, okay? In cases of coastal property, okay, and as it relates to this scalp bounty, they were sold to the highest bidders. So the following account of one of the most coveted fishing areas where the rivers were no longer believed, the children, oh, oops, sorry. I'm jumping around here. Oh, okay, excuse me. Let me just, okay. This, I'm going to jump ahead because I have a slide that I want to bring to your attention. Let me see. And then I'll speak to that. Okay. The prosperous town of Westbrook, Maine came to be named, and this is where the rivers meet the ocean, okay? Came to be named Thomas Westbrook, all right? And this is, you know, the bounty has a direct connection to the town of Westbrook and the naming of Westbrook, okay? And, you know, ultimately, when property was distributed amongst soldiers, it was distributed, and this is a legacy, you know, a direct legacy of that bounty and an impact of that bounty, that soldiers were afforded the prime real estate, okay? And they were also given the first shake or the first opportunity to bid on coastal property, which, by the way, 90% of Maine's coast and its associated islands are owned privately, and they have been handed down privately intergenerationally. Okay. And so there is a rootedness in the scalping bounty, land dispossession, scalping bounty, you know, in attempt to eradicate a whole group of people, which is genocide. Okay. Scalping bounty, land dispossession, and also the ways in which towns are named, you know, and particularly this one is a historical account about Thomas Westbrook. And he was charged with scouting Wabanaki territory in the east, including patrols between the Presumpscot and the Saco rivers. And his commission, as given to him by Lieutenant Governor Doomer, was, quote, "You are to take, intercept, kill, and destroy the Indian enemy in all places where they may be found." Okay. So here, you know, is where I want to you know, and of course, you know, I for many of you that, you know, have seen other presentations that I give, Mary Bassett is a Passamaquoddy elder that reminds us, you know, that we were not supposed to be here. And she literally meant it. And she's passed on now. But in her earlier years, she would do workshops within Wabanaki communities to mobilize knowledge, you know, especially amongst youth, that we have so much to live for because of what we have survived, and to remind us of the strength of our ancestors, and their diligence and what they prayed for, you know. And by the way, it's like, wherever we are and wherever we come from, there were people before us that prayed for our well-being. And so, in many ways, I offer my talk to you as a, you know, as a prayer, because, you know, the world needs and society needs Indigenous spaces of engagement, and ways of knowing and being. And, you know, Mary Bassett lived that life. And she, you know, she taught about oppression and, you know, settler colonialism, you know, as much as in any chance that she could get, and dedicated her life to this. And so, you know, this was something that she instilled upon many of us when we were, you know, younger, and now, you know, are doing a lot of educating on these matters. So to remind us that we were, you know, there was an intention to eradicate us, but we are still here, you know, is her point, right? And so I wanted to get right into Carlisle Indian Industrial School from there, okay? And this is where, you know, I'm going to extrapolate from my dissertation. I had forgotten that I put the town of Westbrook in my talking points here. So I'm just, you know, taking a little sidetrack here. So just bear with me as I do this. Okay, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School started out with 78 students and quickly reached capacity with over 10,700 Native students from 145 different tribes having attended the school before it closed finally in 1918. And so the school became the template for an entire system of residential school warfare in both the United States and Canada. An average of 1 of every 10 children who entered the doors of the school died there, while roughly 1,000 deaths were documented at the school. And only 186 children were buried in its graveyard. There's a graveyard there. The original cemetery was desecrated by the recent construction of the Jim Thorpe Gymnasium. A visible statement, of an institutional preference for burying the truth about its genocidal history. In 2003, a nationwide effort initiated by a Penobscot woman, Betsy Tanian from Indian Island, working in collaboration with families of deceased students and other former students, led to a plaque being erected at the cemetery. Data on the Carlisle Indian Industrial School and the Wapanaki was compiled and used, and I've got it here in the PowerPoint, by both Betsy Tanian and Esther Atian of the Maine Indian Child Welfare Coalition. And this was back in 2003, for the purposes of training social workers in the state to comply with the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. The school's overt and strategic attempt to eradicate our identity through the indoctrination of white values continues to have a severely negative effects on Wabanaki peoples and communities. This, of course, includes low levels of fluency, a particularly devastating impact because our worldview and epistemology are embedded in our language. So the initial era of policy against Indigenous peoples was the genocide, okay? And it continues to be, because genocide continues to be well felt, okay? And the second wave of the second wave of policy, which was the first wave of educational policy against the Wabanaki people, devalued our own knowledge systems and privileged and evaluated and elevated
I saw
Western knowledge systems. So, I just wanted to, bring
on
to light.
MPA site, you had your tournament period. I was going to ask.
Oops, I don't know if I'm getting some feedback or. Okay, I just heard some feedback there. I wasn't sure if someone was interjecting with a question, but I'll just go on from there. Let's see, that this was the first wave of educational policy. Let me just see, I'm trying to find how I how I move around these screens. Okay, so this is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And so, here is a really stark image. And these are great teaching resources and teacher development resources. So I encourage you to really take a close look at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School website. I've given you the website links here. And this is, these are images that we often see, but, this is how a child, was stripped down of their identity when they went into the school, and they were dispossessed of, the basis and the core of who they were. And this is an aesthetic of what that looked like. And it's much deeper than this, hey? So we're surviving the legacy of that. And many identify this as cultural genocide. And there are several of us, including myself, I subscribe to the notion that this is just genocide. And there's also linguistic genocide. And I tend to, more later in my years now, in my mid-career, I'm just careful to say that it is just an outright genocide and an intention to eradicate, an entire people, and including their ways of knowing and being. Okay, these are the names of the Maine Indians that went to Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And, as you can see, just people even that are presenting in this conference today. I'm sure Dr. Darren Ranko has ancestors here. And I certainly have ancestors here, Ada Sockbeson. And then for whatever reason, I'm not sure of this, but Penobscot Indians went to Carlisle Indian Industrial School at a much higher rate than other Maine Indian people in the state. You can see in, this is an appendix from my dissertation, Abenakis that went, Maliseets and Passamaquoddies. So, Penobscot's certainly outnumbered that. And, today we feel the effects of the low fluency within our communities. I wanted to just put their names up here so that you could take a look. And, it's important that they not be forgotten. And again, like Justice Murray Sinclair says, who chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Canada, reconciliation cannot happen without truth. And truth can't get mobilized unless we teach it. And so, this is a real call, for teachers to mobilize the truth and to, educate yourself about these realities so that you can become equipped to teach them. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move into anti-racist conviction. So anti-racist conviction, as I've identified, it calls for the taking up of the lovely knowledge versus the difficult knowledge. Deborah Britzman is a psychologist, an educational psychologist that studies pedagogy. And she identifies this, what I said at the beginning, thickening your skin and opening your heart. So, pedagogically, it's going to require the engagement with anti-racism is going to require the taking up of the difficult knowledge in, if not equal ways, but in foundational ways before the lovely knowledge. Okay. And so when I talk about decolonial mirrors, part of that is, teaching Wabanaki studies and engaging with this material, LD 291, can't just be about teaching about Native people. It's got to be about engaging with what's in front of us. And, it's like Tulku, who is a philosopher, says, trying to change the world without changing our minds is like trying to clean the dirty face in the mirror by just scrubbing the glass. The dirty face doesn't get cleaned by just scrubbing the glass, right? And so that's going to take a certain amount of rethinking the world around us. Now, anti-racism is rooted in critical race theory. Critical race theory is a body of theory that was developed by Black civil rights activists that wanted, and that were taking up how legislation and policy and systems have in it embedded systems of, for instance, systems of segregation and exclusion, the Jim Crow laws that excluded African Americans and from, participating in society and continue to. So anti-racism takes a look at those systemic issues and is rooted in critical race theory. So critical race theory is actually rooted in critical theory. So they build upon one another. And critical theory invites us to rethink the world around us. So however we saw something, in our lives, like an issue, like for instance, teaching about Indigenous peoples or understanding racism, for instance, it could be any issue that is part of that difficult knowledge realm. But critical theory invites us to take a look at that issue. And if you think about it as a box, and maybe we've seen it, one side of that box, and Dr. Abrahampton writes about this, who's an Indigenous scholar, is that we look at one side of the box all of the time. We don't have an opportunity to look at all sides of the box, and in our own stories as Wabanaki people, we have a similar story about seeing the moose and how we see, it's a beautiful story. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get into it now, but the point is that if we are just looking at that one side of the box and we are not afforded an opportunity to see all sides of the box, we are not afforded a comprehensive view of the whole issue, okay? And so I oftentimes will show my students, in class when thinking about critical theory, I get up and I'll stand in front of a chair and I'll say, if this is the issue and I'm only seeing it from one side, and I'm seeing it from a lens that privileges and exonerates, colonial history, like Columbus, for instance, discovered America. If I'm only seeing that from one side, and I'll put a chair in front of the classroom and I'll show my students, I'll say, what critical theory encourages us to do is, to maybe get uncomfortable and go climb under the chair and see what under the chair looks like. Maybe we even have to climb along the wall and situate ourselves on the ceiling so we can look down at the chair to see it from another angle. And critical race theory really encourages us to get uncomfortable, with that difficult knowledge so that we can see the issue from a more comprehensive lens, through a more comprehensive lens by racialized peoples, and in this case, Indigenous peoples. Okay, so anti-racist conviction calls for the taking up of the difficult knowledge, all right, which is a big idea. Okay, so when I talk to you, about, this is sort of like that preparatory work that has to happen as you embark upon teaching about genocide, okay, or teaching about the Indian residential schools. For instance, it's got to be taught in a local manner. It can't just be, well, that happened over in Western Canada, right? And similarly, I tell my students here, the scalping bounty that I showed you earlier happened all along the Eastern Seaboard. It didn't just happen in our territories, in the Maine Indian territories. They were in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, all along the Eastern Seaboard, okay? And so teaching about the truth and, is going to lead to reconciliation. And it will always, Maya Angelou is quite famous for saying, the retching, teaching about the retching history of the United States, teaching about it is going to ensure us that it doesn't ever happen again. And it's painful to teach about it and to learn about it, but it will also ensure that it doesn't happen again. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing for time, but if someone can just interrupt me when I have like 5 minutes left, okay, please. Okay, so tribal critical race theory is something that Brian Brayboy introduced into the literature and informs and shapes anti-racist conviction. And it calls for non-Native people and institutions to hold up that mirror to their own history and identify the benefits inherited from colonialism. Okay, so calling for equitable democracy, Brayboy, Castagno, and Moen offer key questions. Okay, so I would invite you to engage with these questions as you are embarking upon, your own mirror holding up, and as you engage with, teaching about the difficult knowledge. Okay, so how is our life tied with the lives of others? How is our privilege at someone else's expense? How are the decisions we make tied to the well-being of others, no matter how removed by race, nationality, or geography? And so Brian Brayboy has taken, critical theory, critical race theory, to tribal critical race theory and located it in a tribal context by asking these questions. And, to even back it up even more, theory is we do this every day. It's actually something that's a lot more accessible to us. It sounds very inaccessible, but it's something that we do. And theory is just, if you can also just think about theory as how we make sense of the world around us. Okay. Critical theory is how do we rethink, what we've always thought. Okay. And then critical race theory is taking a look at the systems and institutions which are rooted in the laws and policies. Okay. So it was a policy to kill, to go out and scalp Indians and take their live bodies. The policy was a genocidal policy enacted by the government, by the crown, and operationalized, by the British and French. Okay, so then the next policy in ways that genocide became also systemic, which is racialized genocide. Okay, because it was just to Native people, was to kill the Indian in order to save the man. That was the first wave of educational policy. And that was the policy of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, okay, which then became the template for all Indian residential schools. So what happened in Tecumseh's territory of those 215 mass burial, that school's policy was rooted, they followed the Carlisle Indian Industrial School policy that Richard Henry Pratt espoused. Okay, it was, so when I say it's a template for all Indian residential schools of North America, and our people, as Benawapskeg people, were some of the first to go to that school, and we've survived that legacy. And so, you know, it's just something to really, those are just like the big ideas to really understand, okay? So it's no wonder, you know, this is the legacy of that racialized genocide, that intention to eradicate our peoples, okay? So when a people is dispossessed of those ways of knowing and being, when there is an attempt to eradicate us, there is a socioeconomic legacy, you know, of that dispossession, because, you know, with the dispossession of the lands comes tremendous poverty and lack of access to resources. Okay. And so today, you know, or as of the census of 2000, the unemployment rates for 16 and over general population, it is 4.7, whereas Maine Indians, you know, we're about 3 times more likely to be unemployed. Living below the poverty line, Maine Indian people are about 3 to 4 times more likely to be poor than white people. And by the way, Maine is distinct because Maine is the whitest state in the nation. And so I say that, you know, we hear that a lot, right? It's like, okay, yeah, I hear that, but there's something much deeper. And, you know, tribal critical race theory has offered me a lens through which to examine that a bit deeper. Because nowadays, and what I've been thinking about in the past couple of years, is that it's that Maine isn't just the whitest state in the nation. Maine has also been the most successful at its dispossession and intention to eradicate Indigenous peoples of land and power and of people because of the genocidal history as well, right? But so it's important to think about that. You know, why is it that Maine is the whitest state in the nation? What has that been built upon, right? So also in Maine, as Indigenous peoples, we're the least likely to be homeowners in our homeland. Our average life expectancy, for example, is for Maine Indians, it's 63 years old. That's 15 to 20 years shorter than white people, the non-native people in Maine. And that's not indigenous to who we are. And so so there's just some statistics about women and girls, Indigenous women, girls in North America. And so more impoverished than any other demographic group. I just talked about, let's see, the highest suicide rates of any population group in the country, up to 7 times more likely to commit suicide than white people, and 10 times in some places, okay? Native women in North America are 10 times more likely to be victims of violence than non-Native women. And because the majority of the suicides are committed by young people, mothers, and I would say also fathers, grieving their children's untimely deaths are secondary victims. And in terms of student success rates or student, I would just say American Indians rank the least likely to attend and complete university, okay? More than 60% of US high school students go on to college, okay? Whereas only 17% of American Indian students do. While 28% of Americans complete college, only 13% of American Indians do. And that's not indigenous to who we are. In fact, Jack Weatherford writes in his book called Indian Givers, which I highly recommend, young people as early as junior high school read this book. It's a play on the racist rhetoric of Indian Givers, where indeed he documents how over 2/3 of what the world uses every day comes from the innovation, creation, and invention of Indigenous peoples. So from modern medicine, pharmacology, to, he documents, for instance, the Irish potato famine was saved by Indigenous peoples' agricultural approaches, Indigenous and Mayans. It's really an excellent book for some folks, for young people as early as junior high school, and can be read in high school. But it's an excellent example of how these rates don't reflect our intellectual capacities as Indigenous peoples. This is an example and an impact of the systemic racism, okay, and the lack and the barriers to opportunity and the inequitable barriers, that we have. Fiona was talking about being a white woman, a white teacher, and over 80% of the teachers in the United States, Harvard just did this study, over 80% of the teachers in the United States are white. Whereas the classrooms in Maine, excuse me, not Maine, well, it's certainly Maine too, but it's not so much Maine, actually, because Maine is the whitest state in the nation, but this is a national US study. Over 50% of the classrooms in the United States are brown, so are racialized students, right? So the teachers are getting more white, the classrooms are getting more brown. That speaks to how systemic barriers are created in accessing university, because we need to get baccalaureate degrees in order to become teachers, right? So yeah, that just speaks to that, that how racism gets, institutionalized. And I just want to interject here that, consistent with what I was just saying about what Jack Weatherford writes about, Dr. Cora Weber Pillwax also reminds us that as Indigenous peoples, we are so much more than the colonial, than the genocide and the colonial oppression and the socioeconomic statistics I just laid out to you, okay? And that's a really important message as a teacher to relay, to the students, and to also just take on, and to understand, right? We are so much more than the intergenerational trauma that we're surviving, which is very much a reality, but the gaze needs to be taken up with the difficult knowledge and sorted out, okay, and thought about. And
excuse me, Dr. Sockbeson, you asked me to let you know when you've got about 5 minutes. We're at 12:12. I could listen to you all day.
Okay, no, thank you so much, because that helps me to move things along. Okay, so, in light of that, what Sipsis talks about, who is a late Penobscot elder, scholar, artist, she said to a group of us when we were younger, and this is what is going to necessitate when I talk about anti-racist conviction and holding up decolonial mirrors, is to think on, this kind of wisdom, okay? And she talked to us when I was younger. She said, as Native people, we have to think about white people every day. And white people don't ever have to think about us, and that's a way to, rethink, when we're thinking about racism. And, there's a whole body of literature about white privilege that I would strongly encourage you. Peggy McIntosh has written stuff called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It's a very foundational, entry level, accessible, well-written, seminal piece that she wrote as a white woman talking about white privilege. And if you haven't thought about white privilege and understanding white privilege, do so. And that will help you to think about how to teach about genocide. Okay. And that's very fundamental. Okay. And Dina Gilio Whitaker writes about settler privilege, which takes Peggy McIntosh's systems of under and privilege just a little step further and better understanding some of these questions of tribal critical race theory. Okay. Okay. Excuse me. And like late Rainey Aptian, who was also a Harvard graduate, a Penobscot elder, scholar, and master basket maker, is, I quote her quite a bit in my work, but she says, white people like to think we're like a convenience store. They like to come in and buy the candy, the M&Ms of our culture and spirituality, and leave behind all the cleaning products like the oppression, colonialism, and racism, and that's the difficult knowledge, right? And so decolonial mirrors and anti-racist conviction require us to do what Barbara Thomas has, encouraged her daughters to do. Barbara Thomas as a white woman, wrote a letter to her daughters, helping them to make sense of, how we, take up settler colonialism and understanding colonial oppression. And I say this really clearly to the pre-service teachers that I work with, is to remember that you're not responsible for the wrongs committed before you were born, but you can't escape the legacy of those wrongs. So you need to understand some history in order to understand your current position in the world and other people's perceptions of you. And you are responsible for what you do now. Okay. And so here we have the law. It's going to take your political will to actually implement it, because there really is not a Maine state law and Maine Constitution prohibit a statewide curriculum. So we can't, impose a curriculum on you. And that's why Portland is such a phenomenal leader in engaging with the political will to make it a part of Portland's curriculum. Okay. And so, and on top of that, the state doesn't determine which textbooks to use. So it will be very important to follow the curricular, the suggested curricular resources that the Department of Education has posted, as well as what the Portland school system is going to circulate. And I do believe that, that curriculum will have to change as a result, of the new standards. So it's sort of like educators will do so entirely, it'll be a local decision. Curriculum should align to the standards and the assessments that measure them. That's been the case for 16 years under the Maine learning results. But there are many curricular and infinite ways teachers can instruct that will align to the standards. So which curriculum and teaching practices and materials are used is determined locally by school districts and classroom teachers. And so this will take anti-racist conviction, which will require political will to do so. Okay, and I'm just trying to get to my last slide here. Okay, and Wayne Newell, and I just want to, highlight something pedagogically of that, I thanked him in my research for imparting so much wisdom upon me. And he, was really quick to say, it's not my knowledge that I have contributed. I like to think of it more like this. The knowledge is actually the energy created between us when we have these discussions. And that's actually Wabanaki knowledge. And so I would encourage you to think about, it's not going to be perfect. So anyone that's hesitant to approach this material, it's important to educate yourself, with the big concepts that I've just, outlined to you. And do a lot of claiming your own education on this that is guided by, Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples in the state have been guiding the Department of Education resources, as well as what Portland Public Schools is offering. And to know that, knowledge mobilization and knowledge transfer, we are going to make mistakes. But if we stay away from it, we will continue to be hiding the truth. And so it's better to take our best stab at it and remind your students that they are not to be blamed for what they're taking up and what they are understanding, that they're not to be blamed. It's not their fault, but it is our responsibility to know the truth. Okay. And so there is a way to do that. And I would encourage you to think about how Wabanaki knowledge is engaged with, that space of engagement. Paulo Freire calls it the dialectical space, to be engaging with one another with respect, and not, and I would encourage, to reinforce that. And even as you're looking at it and holding up your own decolonial mirror, right? And so, and that's, I've written extensively about red hope and political will, and such change will require the political will of non-Indigenous peoples to meaningfully engage with the more difficult task of taking up Attian's cleaning products to address the colonial oppression and racism. Also critical is the acknowledgement of red hope. And I've written extensively about this, and I could do more lectures on that, but Indigenous peoples will continue to be the leaders in asserting our rights in order to affect social and political change. So when Fiona highlights the reality that we're all doing this voluntarily, you're here voluntarily after your school year has just ended yesterday. And that is what will keep this on the radar. And that to me is, no one can take that away from us. you know, and systems need to change. You know, something like this, you know, should be funded, and we can work internally to sort of sort that stuff out. But as Indigenous peoples, as Maine Indian peoples, we will always be here to do this work and to ensure that it's being done. And we have committed our lives to that. Many of us have committed our lives to that. And so, you know, I've offered you some teaching resources to use. These are just some, okay? You know, the death of the Bering Strait theory, that's another big idea that needs to get disrupted and dismantled. You know, if you're teaching the Bering Strait theory, I would encourage you to check this out, rethink that. I've given you the links to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. There's a whole archive of curricular resources. All of what I've talked about are publications that I have that are available in PDFs. And then there is I think one of the finest curricular resources in teaching this material called Rethinking Columbus. And there's a free PDF of it online, and I've offered you this. And then here are my references, and that is where I will end.